Hello, welcome to the France 24 interview. We are in Brasilia, where our guest today is the Vice President of Brazil, Hamilton Mourão. Good morning, Vice President.
Good morning.
You have now been in power for 200 days alongside Bolsonaro. The economy is in recession, the GDP is shrinking. How would you assess the first 200 days of the government?
Well, firstly, we don't consider this a recession. That's when inflation goes up and there's a sharp reduction in GDP, which is what took place in the last years of the government of President Dilma Rousseff, and which we are still suffering with the 6th consecutive year of the government's accounts in the red. So I consider these first few months to be positive, although, like anything in life, the start has not been as calm and serene as we would like.
In France, the nomination of an army general's vice president, together with the next military man as president, is seen as a cause for concern, especially in a country that was ruled by a military dictatorship. Do you understand this concern?
Well, the first thing I'd like to say to the French people is that we weren't concerned when Charles de Gaulle was elected. We were also elected, so I don't see any cause for concern. The Brazilian Armed Forces are the institution that has the most credibility in the eyes of the population, and I see this as one of the reasons for the electoral victory of a slate formed by two people who are not backed by any of the traditional political parties.
The president's sons are very visible in the political life of the country, so much so that President Bolsonaro has put forward one of them for the role of ambassador to the United States. What do you think about this?
Well, the president's sons form a united group with the political trajectory of the family. Well, this is something very rare in the political history of any country, a president with three high-profile political sons, a senator, a deputy, and a councillor. Now, obviously they have a political influence in those sectors. But in terms of the decision to nominate Eduardo Bolsonaro as ambassador in Washington, it's a decision of the president, and according to our legislation, Eduardo fulfills the requirements of those who are not career diplomats. So it's a decision that we don't dispute. We obey.
Aren't you afraid that Brazil might become a family dynasty?
No, not at all, because our democratic institutions are extremely strong, so I really don't think we've reached that level. This would be a concern if we had an anti-democratic regime.
The president recently declared that the government depends on the agricultural business sector. For the post of Minister for Agriculture, he chose someone with a background as a lobbyist for agribusiness. He's often said that he would like to see the end of the green zones in favor of the mining companies. Are you afraid that the president might be selling Brazil to the agribusiness lobby?
Not at all. I think one thing's clear. More than 40 years ago, a great Brazilian agronomist came to talk to me. I was a lieutenant at the time, and he said to me that the destiny of Brazil was to become the world's big rural producer. Well, I kept that in mind, and today that's becoming a reality. Teresa Cristina, the Minister for Agriculture, is herself a rural producer, highly committed to the sustainability of the business. Because it's those who are involved in the business who are the first to recognise that they can only produce in sustainable conditions, that there's no point in destroying the source of their income, which is the land.
But many farmers are guilty of illegal deforestation, which has increased sharply.
Aqueles que fizeram desmatamento ilegal, eles estão sendo chamados dentro da nossa legislação.
Well, those who are guilty of this are facing the legal consequences. And our legislation is one of the best in the world, and they must fulfil their obligation to plant trees in the areas they have deforested. You touched on the subject of green zones or restricted land. Well, throughout our country we have zones for our indigenous peoples. The president will not overturn any of this. He said that he will not increase the land of the Indians in Brazil. The mining activities in Indian land, the legislation allows this with the permission of those who live there, and as long as it happens in line with environmental protection laws. I've received a number of leaders of the indigenous peoples who are pleading for the right to exploit their lands and help them in their precarious economic situation. And so this is a subject that is under discussion, it's being debated by Brazilian society. And it's an area where the president does not have the power to resolve things on his own with a mere stroke of the pen. The democratic checks and balances function very well here in Brazil.
The Amazon is the length of the planet, and President Bolsonaro dismissed as lies the recent surveys which pointed out an 88% increase in deforestation this year. Do you share this opinion, or are you worried by an increase in deforestation?
There are two aspects. First, the president went back on what he'd originally said, and statistics are a complicated thing to divulge. If last year I deforested 2 football pitches and this year I did 4, there's been an increase of 100%. And this 100% increase, oh my God, it's terrible. But what we have to take into consideration is the effective area of the land which have been deforested and where it happened. And I know the Amazon region very well. I lived there for 5 years. And we are the guardians of the Amazon. It's going to be maintained, preserved and left untouched as much as necessary.
During your time as vice president, hundreds of agrotoxics have had their use permitted. Brazil has become the world's leading consumer, and yet Mercosur has just signed a deal with Europe that has raised serious concerns in France. Do you think Europe is right to be worried?
I think the correct measure is the quantity of agrotoxics used per hectare. And by this measure, we're around the global average. High-intensity agriculture like ours needs to defend itself against pests that are constantly increasing. And our agriculture takes place over an enormous quantity of land.
A large part of these agrotoxics, glyphosate, for example, cause cases of cancer and miscarriages in Mato Grosso and Piauí states. This concerns Europe.
Well, I don't see this data with quite the intensity that you're giving it. The agrotoxics that have been permitted are within the international norms. That's how I see it.
I will send you the data. President Bolsonaro has asked you lately to have a low profile in the media. Is that because you offer some kind of threat to him?
No, I think it's because the lead actor in this film is President Bolsonaro. I'm part of the supporting cast.
Because he recently questioned the existence of hunger in Brazil, and earlier he said that homosexual tourists were not welcome in Brazil. Strong words that shocked people in Europe. Do you share these opinions, or are you more moderate?
Você compartilha essas opiniões ou você é mais moderado?
There's a part of Brazilian society that is extremely conservative, and he seeks to talk to these people. Well, for my part, as I said, I'm a member of the supporting cast, here to help him in whatever is necessary.
Changing subjects, the number of women killed in Brazil is one of the highest in the world. 4 women on average murdered every day. And your government is trying to make it easier to own a gun. Do you see this as a solution?
The question of gun ownership is a campaign promise of the president's, supported by a large number of people who voted for him. A number of countries allow gun ownership. So I don't see this relation between having a gun and increasing violence. I think the violence is connected to patterns of behaviour, to cultural factors.
Macho culture?
uma cultura machista.
Macho culture.
E o que ocorre?
And what's happening is that society is changing,
Está mudando,
with women participating in the labour market
na sociedade,
and having more freedom.
no mercado de
And
trabalho.
some of the men have become anxious about this
Determinada parcela dos homens
and have looked to violence to sort out a question that should simply have been resolved with a separation and each one getting on with their lives.
Why not set an example and put more women in the government?
No governo.
Você tem notado o seguinte, né? Nós
Well,
temos
in our political legislation, the parties have to reserve a certain amount of places for women, and it's proved extremely difficult to fill those places. The parties have had problems finding enough female candidates. So in political life, we still have progress to make.
Because there are not enough women or because they're not competent?
Because there are not enough. They have more than enough competence.
You run an anti-corruption electoral campaign, promising a clean administration, marking a position in contrast with the previous regimes of Dilma Rousseff and Lula. Since then, Senator Flávio Bolsonaro, the son of the president, has been accused and implicated in a corruption scandal. Is this hypocrisy, or do you intend to keep your promises?
né? Nós temos que olhar que os
Well, we have to see that the governments of Presidents Dilma and Lula robbed the country, robbing in an incompetent manner a dreadful administration, throwing the doors wide open to corruption that almost brought Petrobras and other companies to the floor. In our government, you can see no cases of corruption. You mentioned the case of Senator Flávio Bolsonaro. There is a case against him underway in Rio de Janeiro. It has nothing to do with a car wash anti-corruption inquiry, and the president has already said that if his son is guilty of anything, he should pay for it.
Do you have the ambition to become president one day?
Não, eu não tenho essa ambição, né? Eu nunca tive ambições políticas na
No, I don't have this ambition. I never had political ambitions in my life. I was invited by President Bolsonaro to be his running mate, like the soldier that I've always been serving the country. If, at the end of this period, the president puts himself up for re-election and chooses someone else, then I'll get on with my life. I have lots of things to do.
Continua a minha vida, eu tenho bastante coisa para fazer.
And if he doesn't put himself up for re-election, would you run in his place?
Vamos pensar nisso.
Let's think about that one.
Thank you very much, Vice President. And thank you for watching. Do stay tuned on France 24.
Liberté, égalité, actualité.